The coffin is closed, and the air is thick with silence. Not the soft, respectful quiet of mourning, but a weight, a quiet born of indifference, of a life that was once full of promise, but now left to fade into the shadows of history. A woman, once queen, lies in a tomb, her name lost to time. Her face, once radiant, now fades in the dim light of a forgotten chamber. This is the end of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, the woman who gave him everything and received nothing. Her death was not marked by a grand procession. There were no crowds weeping in the streets, no banners flown at half-mast for a woman who had been more than just a queen. She had been a partner, a mother, a symbol of strength in a kingdom full of turbulence. Yet, when her time came, she died, alone, far from the court, far from the man who had sworn to love her. It wasn't the executioner's axe that took her. It wasn't a violent rebellion or betrayal. It was the slow, quiet collapse of a woman who had been forced to watch her world crumble around her. A woman who had given her youth, her loyalty and her love to a man who never truly appreciated her. And in the end, Henry VIII had moved on. But why did she die alone? Why, when her heart had given everything, did she leave this world without a crown on her head and without a final cry for justice? She had given him an heir, had walked beside him as his queen for over 2 decades, and yet she died in obscurity. Her last breath barely had time to be mourned before Henry's eyes turned to his next wife, his next conquest. So we ask, what is the cost of loyalty when your king demands betrayal? Because Catherine's death was not just the death of a woman, it was the death of her legacy, the death of the queen who had everything, and the death of a woman who was lost in the kingdom that never truly valued her. Catherine of Aragon entered the stage of Tudor history not as a mere princess, but as a beacon of strength. The daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the rulers of Spain, she was the jewel of 2 great kingdoms, a symbol of unity in a time when Europe was split by religious conflict and political rivalries. She was everything a queen should be, poised, educated, dutiful, and devoted. Her beauty was understated, soft, regal, and dignified, but it was her character, her intelligence, and her unwavering loyalty that truly captured Henry VIII's heart. When Catherine arrived in England to marry Henry, she was not just a foreign princess. She was a promise of stability. The marriage was a political one, meant to strengthen the ties between England and Spain, but it blossomed into something far greater. For a time, Henry adored her. Their marriage was a fairy tale, a union forged in the glow of hope and ambition. Catherine stood beside him as he was crowned king, and together they ruled with a vision for a peaceful, united England. She bore Henry a child, but it was a daughter. Her daughter, a disappointment in the eyes of a king whose obsession with a male heir had only just begun to grow. But even then, Catherine held strong. She stood by Henry's side, supporting him through his challenges, her loyalty never wavering, her love never faltering. She was the queen the people adored, the one who could always be relied upon to stand firm in times of crisis. Her rise was not marked by scandal or manipulation. Catherine was the quiet strength of the Tudor dynasty, the steady hand in a world ruled by the whims of men. She was a woman who believed in the sanctity of her marriage vows, who honored her king even when his love began to fade. For many years she was untouchable, a queen not just in name but in essence. But the story of her rise was always destined to end. For in a court full of intrigue and power struggles, no one could remain untarnished forever. So we ask, what does it mean to rise when the world around you is already set to tear you down? Because Catherine's ascent was not just a journey to power, it was the beginning of her undoing. And even in the brilliance of her reign, the seeds of betrayal had already been planted. The silence between them grew louder than any scream. Years passed and still no son came. Miscarriages, stillbirths, tiny coffins that never made it to the chapel. Each loss added another crack to the golden image of their union. Catherine prayed harder, fasted longer. But even the saints seemed to look away. Henry's gaze drifted, first to shadows, then to courtiers, and finally to Anne Boleyn. Young, sharp, untamed. She did not bow her head or whisper sweet assurances. She challenged, she flirted. She refused him, at first, and in doing so became irresistible. Catherine, once the Rose of England, became a relic of a love that now felt more like duty than desire. But she held firm. She would not go quietly. She reminded Henry and the court of her sacred vow. That she was queen not by charm but by God's will, that their marriage had been blessed by Rome and bound in heaven. She would not be cast aside like a worn garment. Yet Henry was changing, obsessed with producing an heir, consumed by the idea that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. His advisors whispered of Leviticus, of sin, of divine wrath. Anne whispered of reform, of freedom from Rome, of a new England. Catherine watched as the world shifted under her feet. The court turned cold, friends vanished. Even her daughter Mary was declared illegitimate. Her rooms were moved, her titles stripped. Still, she refused to yield. Alone, aging, grieving, she held to the belief that righteousness would prevail. But what is righteousness in a kingdom ruled by desire? Was it love that bound Henry to her once, or a mask worn by ambition? Because now, the very man who once knelt to kiss her hand was tearing her life apart, limb by limb, name by name. And Catherine, steadfast and pious, found herself standing on the edge of a battlefield where loyalty was her only armor. What happens when a woman's virtue becomes the very thing used to destroy her? This was the moment it all changed. Not with a sword, but with silence. Not with a battle, but with a signature on parchment. Henry had chosen his path, and Catherine, for all her grace, would not be part of the England he was about to build. The Queen had become the obstacle, and obstacles, in his world, were meant to be erased. They moved her to a damp castle, not as a prisoner, not quite, but not as a queen either. Her banners were lowered, her seal confiscated. The servants once sworn to her now bowed to another. Even her title was erased from court documents. Not Catherine the Queen, just the Dowager Princess of Wales, a cruel reminder of her first marriage, not the one she had lived and bled for. The rooms were cold, the walls whispered. Food arrived late, sometimes spoiled. Letters from her daughter were censored or worse, never delivered. They said it was for her health. They said she was being treated with dignity. But Catherine knew what it meant to be slowly buried while still breathing. Henry, once her beloved, did not visit, did not write, did not send even a token of affection. He had his new court now, his new queen. Anne walked the same halls Catherine once ruled, draped in jewels that once belonged to her. She sat on her throne, she wore her crown, but Catherine did not curse her. She prayed. Not for revenge, but for truth to be seen, for souls to be judged not by kings, but by the heavens. Her faith, once a source of strength, now became a cage. It kept her still, silent, loyal to a God who watched as she decayed in a forgotten room. She was offered comfort, if only she would accept the annulment, if only she would renounce her title, admit that she had never truly been queen, that her marriage was a lie. But how could she? To do so would be to unmake her daughter, to erase her very identity. Catherine was not made of that kind of weakness, so she waited, grew thinner, pale. Her hair grayed like winter frost, settling on a garden never meant to bloom again. Her world shrank to a few stone corridors and a chapel where she knelt daily on aching knees. The court mocked her. Some called her stubborn, others mad. Few remembered her as the radiant queen who once stood beside a golden king. But inside the silence, she endured. What does it mean to be right when the world no longer cares about truth? Catherine of Aragon did not fall in scandal. She was not executed. She was not disgraced. She was erased, slowly, patiently. With every passing day, the crown she once wore dissolved, until all that remained was a woman waiting to die so that her memory could be rewritten. Her body began to betray her long before the final breath. It started with the aching in her limbs, deep, stubborn, relentless. The cold stone floors chilled her bones even in summer. and she coughed through nights that stretched like prayers unanswered. Her attendants whispered about fever, about the color of her skin, about how her hands shook when she reached for the rosary. They said age, they said grief. But this was something older than sorrow, and sharper than time. She bled, from places that should not bleed. And when she wiped her mouth, the cloth came away stained dark. She hid it at first. Pride still held her spine straight, but soon even pride collapsed beneath the weight of rot. Her face hollowed, her stomach swelled unnaturally, as if her body refused to let go of something it could no longer carry. And still she prayed. The stench began, faint at first, a sourness in the room that clung to the bed linens and drifted into the tapestries. Her attendants burned herbs. They opened windows, then nailed them shut. The wind hurt her joints. The air, even when fresh, seemed filled with ash. She was dying, slowly, not in glory, not with an audience, but in a forgotten corner of England, in a castle no longer royal, under sheets stained with illness and memory. The physicians called it a tumor, or an infection, or divine punishment. No one knew, no one cared to know. Her lips cracked when she spoke. Her voice thinned until it barely touched the walls. Even her final letters were written by others. Her words, yes, but their ink. And in the end, she could not eat, could not sit, could barely whisper the names of those she still loved. She asked for Mary. They did not let her come. She asked for Henry. He sent a message. Nothing more. So she lay, curled in her illness like a saint nailed to an invisible cross, waiting for either God or death to reach her first. Does the body rot faster when the soul is still grieving? And when the end drew close, she clutched her crucifix, but her fingers, stiff with disease, could no longer hold it. It fell to the floor, and no one picked it up. She died not as a queen nor even as a wife, but as a discarded memory, tucked away in the damp corridors of a forgotten castle. No bells tolled for her. No royal physician marked the moment. Only a maid heard the rattle in her chest turn to stillness. And even she hesitated before announcing it, for what was there to announce? The former queen, Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Spain, widow of Arthur, abandoned wife of Henry, was already a ghost long before her breath stopped. Her body was pale, sunken, her mouth open just slightly, as if even death could not stop her from trying to speak one last prayer. The crucifix she once clutched lay on the floor beside the bed, cold, untouched. The sheets had not been changed in days. Her skin had begun to blister. There were dark spots on her chest and legs. The stench in the room was unbearable. And yet, no royal messenger came, no priest, no final blessing from the man who once swore eternal love beneath golden arches. Henry sent no word. He was with Anne, perhaps laughing, perhaps already dreaming of the next heir. A chest was prepared, not gold, not velvet, pinewood, plain, nails hammered in silence. No one dared speak above. A whisper. Her body, hastily dressed in faded linen, was laid inside with only her wedding ring and a single prayer folded between her fingers. There was no state funeral, no mourning in Parliament. She was buried at Peterborough, not as queen but as dowager, Princess of Wales. Even in death, Henry denied her name, and then came the rumors that her heart had turned black, that her body bled long after her breath had stopped, that when the priest opened the coffin to anoint her, the room filled with a strange, choking scent, sweet, rotting, unbearable. Whispers echoed, poison, punishment, prophecy. But there was no investigation, no inquiry, just silence. The kind of silence that screams. Is the cruelest death the one no one remembers to mourn? And so she passed, not into legend, but into shadow. The only wife Henry never divorced, yet the only one he abandoned so completely. And in that silence, Catherine found what Henry never could: dignity. The grave was shallow, not in depth but in memory. Catherine of Aragon was lowered into the earth as a footnote, stripped of crown, title, and reverence. No velvet drapes lined the cathedral. No sea of mourners bowed their heads in unified sorrow. Only a modest procession of loyal attendants and aging clergy followed her coffin. whispering prayers into the wind as if afraid the king might hear. She was buried in Peterborough Abbey, far from the grandeur of Westminster, far from the man she had once called husband. On her tombstone they etched the words Dowager Princess of Wales, not Queen of England. That was the final insult, the last denial of a life lived in devotion, duty, and unshakable belief. Her enemies called her obstinate. Her allies called her holy. But all agreed on one truth: she never gave in. In the court, her name vanished. Henry forbade mourning. No courtly black, no tears in public. Her memory became a danger, a relic of an inconvenient past. Her daughter Mary was not even allowed to attend the funeral, the child of a cast-aside queen, silenced like her mother. And yet, Mary remembered. She carried her mother's grief like a torch, quietly, fiercely, waiting. Whispers traveled across Europe that the English king had let a queen rot in exile, that divine punishment would follow, that no man who dishonored a queen so devout could escape the eye of heaven, and indeed Henry's house would begin to crumble, not all at once, but piece by piece. Jane Seymour would die, Anne Boleyn would fall, sons would wither, daughters would rise in vengeance. Catherine did not haunt Henry with ghostly screams or night terrors. She haunted him with silence, with dignity, with the quiet horror of being the woman he could not destroy, only erase. But even erasure leaves behind dust. And in that dust, something remained. A question, a warning, a wound never healed. What becomes of a king who buries the woman who loved him and calls it justice? She died without a crown, but she never lost her throne, not in the hearts of those who remembered. Catherine of Aragon became more than a wife, more than a queen, more than a cast-aside consort in the endless tragedy of Tudor power. She became the symbol of a woman who stood before a storm and refused to move. And in the quiet echo of her downfall, something sacred endured. While the others were paraded, beheaded, and burned into legend, Catherine's suffering took no dramatic shape. There was no axe, no scaffold, no crowds gasping at a severed head. Her death was slower, more invisible. It came not with a blade, but with time, with the erosion of dignity, the fading of titles. The silence of halls once filled with her voice, but this is what makes her story all the more horrifying, because she lived and was erased. And in that erasure, we see the darkest truth of monarchy, not the spectacle of blood, but the quiet annihilation of a soul. They didn't need to kill Catherine violently, they just needed her to disappear, to become a relic, an inconvenience, a foreign body in an English crown, and still she endured, in letters sent to Rome, in whispered prayers behind abbey walls, in the tears of her daughter Mary, who would one day rise, wielding a crown not to honor her father but to avenge her mother. The legacy of Catherine bled into English history like ink on parchment, subtle, permanent, unspoken. And in Henry's world, so obsessed with legacy, power, control, Catherine became the one thing he could never truly claim. He broke her marriage, yes, but not her will. He silenced her voice, but not her story. He exiled her body, but not her memory. And that is the great irony. The wife he loved the least in public was the one who haunts his myth the most, because she did not die for treason or for infidelity. She died for dignity. She died because she refused to say a lie, to call herself what she was not. She died because she believed that truth mattered more than survival. So what does Catherine's story teach us? It teaches us that sometimes the most terrifying legacy is not carved in violence but in stillness. That power is not only about swords and crowns, but about silence, exile, and forgetting. That history buries those it cannot control. But the earth does not forget, and neither do we. Catherine of Aragon died alone, humiliated, stripped of her title, separated from her child. But in doing so, she revealed the rot beneath the gold. She was not a martyr, she was not a saint. She was something far more dangerous. She was a woman who refused to kneel. And when we ask, what becomes of a queen caste? Aside for a liar, we must also ask, what becomes of a world that allows it? Her ghost walks not in shadows, but in truth, and that in the end is what endures.